Two policemen walk into a crowded restaurant. They laugh loudly, point at an old black man sitting alone, and start making humiliating comments. But then, something unexpected at his table changes everything. And you need to hear what happened next. Prejudice is a wound that many pretend doesn't exist. This is the story of a man who experienced it himself, but who, in a moment of silent courage, taught a lesson that no one in that restaurant would ever forget. Get ready, because this story will move you. It was a sultry summer afternoon in a small village in the south of the United States, where time seemed to pass slowly but social tensions never slept. The restaurant in the heart of town, known for its simple, homemade dishes, was busy as usual. The sound of laughter, cutlery clattering on plates, and animated conversations filled the room, creating a vibrant atmosphere, but one charged with something unseen: silent judgments. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. And so, when an elderly black man entered, alone, with a calm but visibly humble posture, he attracted glances that said more than words. He was not a familiar face there. His presence was almost an interruption in the routine of that community. He wore a worn but clean shirt, slightly baggy pants, and a pair of worn boots that, despite everything, still carried traces of dignity. His gaze was serene but attentive, like someone who had already seen much more than anyone there could imagine. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to eat a quiet meal. He sat down at a table near the window, where the sun gently illuminated his weathered skin. The waiter approached to take his order, and the old man, with a slight smile, asked for the simplest dish on the menu. "A coffee too, please," he added, his voice firm but unhurried. The interaction was normal until two young policemen entered the restaurant. They were off duty, but still wearing partially open uniforms, as if they wanted everyone to know who they were and what they represented. The air of authority they carried seemed to be less about protection and more about dominance. As the policemen walked through the restaurant, talking loudly, their laughter echoed, attracting attention. They stopped for a moment when they spotted the elderly man, exchanging quick glances that carried a clear message: target found. They intentionally chose a table next to his and began to talk even more exaggeratedly, raising their tone and directing comments to the table next to them. "Hey, look who came to dinner tonight. What do you think? Is he going to be able to pay?" One of them commented, loud enough for everyone to hear. The other replied with a loud laugh, which made some of the customers around exchange uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. The old man continued to sit in silence. His eyes didn't look directly at them, but neither did they show submission. He seemed to have learned, over a long life full of struggles, not to give power to those who sought to humiliate him. But his calmness seemed to irritate the policemen even more, who saw his lack of reaction as a veiled challenge. One of them stood up and approached the man's table. "What's the matter, old man? Can't you talk? Or are you just hiding behind that silence?" he said, his tone alternating between mocking and teasing. The whole restaurant fell silent. All conversation ceased and people watched from their seats, caught between curiosity and fear of getting involved. The elderly man slowly raised his gaze and, for the first time, faced the policeman directly. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Without saying a word, he took something from his pocket, a small notepad and a simple pen. He wrote something silently, in careful handwriting, and put the pad back on the table, next to his plate. The simple, calculated attitude seemed to confuse the policeman, who picked up the pad and read what was written. He frowned, clearly disconcerted, but said nothing. The old man just tilted his head slightly to one side, as if to say, "Now you know." The other policeman, who was still sitting down, asked impatiently, "What did he write?" But before he could answer, the waiter returned with the old man's order, placing the plate and coffee in front of him. "Here you are, sir. Enjoy your meal," said the waiter, trying to break the heavy atmosphere. The man smiled, thanked him and began to eat, completely ignoring the two policemen, who were now visibly annoyed. It was as if, by not reacting, he had taken away all the power they thought they had. But the tension didn't go away. The people in the restaurant were still looking, and the two policemen were still standing there, trying to decide what they would do next. They didn't know that the old man's small gesture, the notepad and the written words, would be the start of something that would completely change the course of that afternoon. And this is where the real lesson begins. The restaurant, which had once been full of voices and everyday sounds, now seemed suspended in an uncomfortable silence. Each person there was trapped in an internal dilemma: watch in silence or intervene. The two policemen didn't hide their frustration, especially the one holding the small notepad. He read the words again, as if he couldn't process their impact. His partner, impatient, stood up abruptly and snatched the pad from his hands, looking at the words with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Is this some kind of joke, old man? Do you think you can just write that down and get away with what's going on here?" The old man remained impassive, calmly cutting his food and chewing slowly, as if the weight of the situation didn't affect him. He looked serene, but anyone who looked closely would notice something deeper in his expression. It was a silence that didn't signify fear, but wisdom, the wisdom of someone who has faced worse situations and survived. He knew he didn't have to stoop to their level to get out of that situation. Meanwhile, the policeman's partner read aloud what was written on the pad, as if to expose the man to ridicule. "Everyone reveals who they really are by the way they treat others." What was that supposed to mean? Some kind of moral lesson? "Do you think you're better than us?" His voice was laced with sarcasm, but there was a nervous undertone, as if those words had touched something deeper, something he didn't want to admit. The whole restaurant watched, many not even blinking, waiting for what would come next. No one knew how it would end, but everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. A woman at the next table, holding the menu with trembling hands, seemed on the verge of intervening, but hesitated. A younger man at the back of the restaurant took out his cell phone and began recording discreetly. Even the waiter, who minutes before had been trying to ease the tension, now stood at a safe distance, watching with a mixture of concern and expectation. "Listen here, old man. Do you think you're above the things that happen in this world? That we don't have to remind you who's in charge around here?" said the more impulsive policeman, leaning over the old man's desk. The other tried to restrain him, pulling him by the arm, but it was too late. "Let me take care of this," he muttered. However, contrary to what many expected, the old man didn't back down. He finished chewing, carefully put his fork back on his plate and wiped the corners of his mouth with a napkin before finally speaking. "You have a choice now," he said, his voice low but laden with gravity. "You can keep acting like little men, trying to prove something to yourselves, or you can decide to be better. The choice is yours, but know this: nothing you do or say will change who I am. It will only expose who you are to everyone here." The old man's words, spoken with such calm and conviction, seemed to echo through the restaurant, touching every person present. There was something in his voice that conveyed authority, but not authority imposed by force or power. It was something deeper, an authority that came from a life lived with integrity and resilience. He wasn't trying to humiliate the officers. He was giving them an opportunity to reflect, to choose a different path. The policeman holding the notepad hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. He seemed on the verge of saying something, but was interrupted by his partner, who slammed his hand on the table. "You think you can teach us a moral lesson, do you? That you know more about life than we do?" He laughed, but there was something forced in his tone, as if he was trying to hide the insecurity that was beginning to grow inside him. Just then, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman, who had been sitting alone in a corner of the restaurant, stood up. Her steps were slow but determined, and she walked over to the elderly man's table, stopping next to him. "He's right," she said, looking directly at the policeman. Her voice trembled a little, but her words were firm. "I've seen things like this happen all my life. People like you using your uniform to intimidate and humiliate those you think are beneath you. But you know what it really shows? That you're afraid. Afraid that, without the uniform, you're nobody." The entire restaurant fell completely silent. Even the policeman seemed surprised by the woman's intervention, but she continued, now more forcefully. "I know this man," she said, putting her hand on the old man's shoulder. "Do you know who he is? He needs no introduction, but I'll tell you anyway. He's a hero. He served this country, fought in wars so that you would have the freedom to act as you are acting now. And yet he's here, showing more respect and dignity than you." The silence that followed the woman's speech was so thick that it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of unspoken injustices. Every second that passed made the tension grow, and the room seemed to compress around the two policemen, who were now completely disoriented. The woman's words, so simple and direct, penetrated deeper than any aggressive approach or insult. There was no escaping the reality she had exposed. They were there, not as the agents of the law they believed themselves to be, but as simple men, with fears and insecurities like anyone else. The youngest of the policemen looked visibly shaken, sweat beginning to bead on his brow, although he tried to disguise it. He looked at his partner, as if looking for a way out, an explanation for what was happening, but his partner, normally so quick to react, seemed paralyzed. He didn't even know what to say. The situation made no sense to him. Everything he knew about authority, respect and power was being questioned there, at a simple restaurant table, in front of an old man and a brave woman. That man wasn't crumbling. He wasn't letting himself be intimidated. He was standing on his own dignity, something the policeman couldn't understand at the time. The elderly man, unperturbed, didn't rush to react. His posture remained the same as before, firm, calm, as if he was waiting for the hubbub to die down before taking the floor. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The pressure that had fallen on the policeman was now growing on them, and, for a brief moment, it seemed that their very idea of authority was being turned upside down. It was at that moment that the waiter, who had been discreetly observing the whole scene, did something no one expected. He approached, walking firmly up to the policeman's table, and before anyone could react, he said with a calmness that contrasted with the tension in the air, "Do you two know who's sitting there? He's not just an old man. He's more than that. I see you everywhere, thinking you're great, but you know what? He's lived longer than any of you will ever live. And frankly, what you're doing here means nothing in the face of that." The waiter, who had once seemed like a simple observer, now became an unexpected figure of resistance, and his eyes shone with a raw truth that echoed in the restaurant. He knew what it meant to be invisible, to be what others look at without seeing. And he also knew that, next to the old man, any insult lost in that place became small. This man, he continued, pointing at the old man, fought against oppression. He fought for you, for every single person here. And this is how you treat him. It was the turning point. What had seemed like a simple confrontation turned into something bigger. The other customers, until then silent spectators, began to move, to raise their voices, to murmur amongst themselves. Some began to applaud timidly, others simply stood, taking a clear position next to the man who, in silence, had become the symbol of dignity in the midst of humiliation. The gaze of the policeman, once implacable, now showed doubt. What had once seemed to be a simple control of a situation, an old man, a simple disagreement, now became a judgment of their own character. The younger man, still unsure of what to do, looked at his partner, his eyes searching for some kind of response, but his partner, once so firm, now seemed at a loss for words. He looked at the old man and saw something he had never imagined he would see: respect. Something he hadn't given, but which was now being challenged, clearly and unchangeably. That was when, finally, the older policeman, the one who had been trying to maintain authority, the one who had remained silent until that moment, lowered his gaze. He looked down at the notepad that was still on the table, the words written on it now seeming like an unbearable weight. The old man's words, "Nothing you do or say will change who I am. It will only expose who you are to everyone here," were reverberating in his mind, each syllable falling heavily on him. He knew what he had to do, not because it was right in a moral sense, but because, at that moment, there was no more room for arrogance. The silence, until then heavy and muffled, was now filled with an indescribable pressure. Finally, he took a step back and, without looking at the old man, muttered something inaudible to his partner. Without saying another word, he reached for his belt buckle, adjusted his hat and, in a gesture no one could have expected, began to walk away, dragging his partner with him. The tension didn't disappear completely, but something broke at that moment. They had chosen to leave with their heads down, recognizing that true strength, true dignity, lay not in the uniform they wore, but in the way they dealt with others, with those around them, with those who, in the end, were all human. What happened next was a moment of catharsis, as if the whole restaurant had exhaled a collective breath, and everyone, without exception, had somehow freed themselves from the silent pressure surrounding them. The old man, who had been treated like nothing, now became the greatest of them all, not for doing something extraordinary, but for being extraordinary in his simple and honorable way of life. The waiter, the other customers, and even the most distant observers now saw him differently. They had witnessed, without realizing it, something that few have the opportunity to see, a true lesson in humanity and respect. And at that moment, with the restaurant slowly returning to normal, the policeman, and everyone there knew that the impact of what they had just witnessed would echo far longer than any formality or confrontation of authority. The restaurant, now silent, breathed an air of lightness that had previously seemed impossible. The weight of tension slowly dissipated, and what began as a moment of humiliation and abuse of power became a lesson that many would never forget. The old man, with his unwavering stance, demonstrated that true greatness does not lie in brute force or control, but in dignity, patience, and, above all, respect. He didn't need to shout or make a fuss. His presence, his calm, said more than any words could express. For the policeman, what happened there was a shock of reality. They left that restaurant not only ashamed, but also questioning their own attitudes and beliefs. What they saw as authority and respect suddenly seemed fragile and empty. It was the contrast between power and humanity, and at that moment, humanity won. They had lost themselves in their own pride, but that old man, with his serene gaze, reminded them of something fundamental. Respect is not earned by force, but by empathy and the way we treat others. As the customers in the restaurant began to resume their conversations and laughter filled the room again, the old man remained silent, as if he knew that his role there had been fulfilled. He didn't need applause or recognition. He knew that the impact of that simple interaction would remain etched in everyone's memory. Sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from grandiose speeches or gestures, but from silent moments when actions speak louder than any words. This incident, although brief, reminded everyone that, in the end, we are all equal, and that true authority never comes from fear or repression, but from mutual respect. At the heart of that little mess, a big lesson was learned. Stories like this show us the power of fighting prejudice and valuing those who really matter. If you believe in a world with more empathy, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future videos. And for those of you who like a good story and watch to the end, leave a comment. I stayed until the end. Remember, the most valuable lessons come from the most difficult moments. See you in the next video.